You know, I have to look around for a stole to wear whenever I go out. I have a few. I have several that were given to me by this congregation. This one I'm pretty sure was for my 10th anniversary. Alyssa might remember, of ordination. So anyway, it did come from here. Thank you. Memorial Day. It's a special time. It's time for remembrance, to go to the beach. Yeah, right. No. It's a time to remember those who perished in warfare, yes. But it's also always been a time of celebration, of flowers, you know, so many flowers. And we often find a way to go out into nature, to take a walk, to be with our loved ones. And so I'm going to start today with a story from a recent family hike. We, a very large, multi-generational group, including the little girl in the other room, were on a path not too far from here. We were mostly going across a field with beautiful views. And for some reason, my kids brought up a minor complaint about me from their childhood. Oh, it comes up almost every hike. Let me tell you. Apparently, I have long lived with a set of rules that is mostly true of Europe and pretty much not at all true of the United States of America. In Sweden, it is called allemans rätt. Everyone's right. When I was in Sweden in college for a semester, this is where I came across the concept. Now, it means that everyone has the right to roam the countryside and to pick flowers, berries, mushrooms, to, you know, walk, ride, bicycle, cycle, ski, whatever, even to camp. Now, allemans rätt is not about public lands only. It's a much larger concept. Yes, you could practice this on golf courses and farms and business properties and country estates, you know? Of course, there were guidelines. This is a sermon all about guidelines. I know most people don't want to hear about guidelines, but there are guidelines for allemans rätt, and they're pretty small and simple. They include things like, well, don't get too close to the private homes, you know? Don't go picking their most prized cultivated rose. Now, you could pick some other flowers, you know, if they're not such a big deal. Don't disturb the sensitive areas like wetlands. You know, some very common sense understandings of guidelines. And they were ways to roam in that shared space with others and not to bother other people in the process. I sure hope allemans rätt is still the practice in Sweden. It's been a while. And I love it. It makes perfect sense to me. I brought it home. I live by it. I roam pretty freely. My kids find it embarrassing. Oh, yeah. And other Americans can strongly object. So I have found over the years. For example, right here in Great Barrington, oh yes, I used to live in Great Barrington. I was once yelled at belligerently by someone who was I didn't know him very well, I barely knew him, but he was a leader in a nearby church. I believe he was a deacon. And I didn't realize I was actually even on his property, a very remote part of his property. He knew it, and boy, was he pissed. Much more recently, maybe about 4 years ago, I was trespassing, there's no other word for it, up a hill. It's called Hospital Hill in my town in Cambridge, New York, and you go there because the hospital at the top has long been abandoned. It was a complex of buildings, one big hospital, a school, other things up there. And so everybody, believe me, walks up Hospital Hill, or used to, anyway. And so, especially during COVID, it was a really great way to get my exercise. You climb in a hill, you're getting a little huff, huff, huff. And sure enough, a neighbor couple tattled on me. The police followed me up. Nobody else drives up Hospital Hill, but they were able to drive up Hospital Hill. They moved the gate and drive up the old road, and they start taking down my name and my address. They didn't give me a ticket, thank goodness, a big, strong warning. I haven't been up Hospital Hill hardly at all since then. I used to walk it several times a week. I know that my neighbor, who is a retired Presbyterian minister, says he walks Hospital Hill still. At the time or two that I've done it, you take a more remote path up, and you hope you don't get caught, basically. So, and anyway, I thought, does my neighbor, the retired minister, also know about Alleman's rate? Or just some common sense about how we really should share and not do this thing that Americans do about making private property so sacred, putting up no trespassing signs every which way. Well, I do realize that I have gotten less bold with Alleman's rate. Recently, I was walking on a sidewalk not far from my home. I passed the most gorgeous, deep purple lilacs. Mine are just pale purple, deep purple, and I was going to pick them, and then I said, no, private property, I better not do that. So even a nonconformist ends up conforming sometimes. But it's not just this concept out of Sweden. In Scotland, which we visited years ago for a couple of times, there are trail guides in Scotland. You can get the guides, and there are instructions on them about what to do. You can go across, the path takes you across golf courses, across pastures. There's a little note about, please close the gates. You're going across a pasture, there are farm animals, close the gates. But in Europe, it's almost impossible not to close the gates. They make it where you don't just open something, you go into a little enclosure, and like there's two openings or whatever. Some of you have seen this. I imagine in most of the world, people can roam more freely across properties rather than what we've done in this country. I realize I'm a little more European than American in this sense. It's not that I throw out all the rules, as that I would rather go by a different set of rules. Guidelines are important. When I lived in Virginia not too many years ago, I was a recently retired minister then. I regularly attended the interfaith clergy group, and they had this wonderful practice there. Great Barrington doesn't do it for the interfaith group, but once a year, the local funeral home would give all the ministers a beautiful lunch at a restaurant. Of course, we were all going to have to work together all year long, so they give us this wonderful lunch out. But let me tell you, when you get a room full of ministers and undertakers, you can just imagine there's a lot of dark humor, a lot of gallows humor. You hear stories that you wouldn't want to laugh at in front of your congregation, but you do because, who's in the room? The people who know about death, you and the undertakers. So the undertakers told us some funny stories. I mean, I think they were there to entertain the ministers, even more than ministers entertaining the undertakers. So a man had died. I'll start it this way. A man had called the police about his neighbor. He saw his neighbor in the middle of the night digging what clearly looked like a grave. He looks out his window, he knows that this neighbor's mom, old lady, lives in that house, is very poorly off, and he thinks, oh no, The son did her in. He's going to sneakily throw her in the middle of the night. So he calls up the police, and the police come rooming out in Virginia to check this out. Yeah, well, she had died, the old lady, that evening. In Virginia, it is legal, a different kind of guideline, to bury your loved ones in your yard. So there are some guidelines, not too close to a stream, for example, little common sense guidelines. And so, of course, the man had wasted no time after Mom passed away, digging the hole and putting his mama in, and the very night she died, all legal, if creepy. Rules to live by, guidelines. They're all around us. Recently, I read a reference in the news to something called the Powell Doctrine. It was designed by our former Secretary of State, Colin Powell, and the description of it sounded like something I had studied in theological school, the just war theory. And they're very related. So I'm looking it up, and I realized that, the just war theory, Augustine, 4th century, is not the first time that humans tried to devise rules for warfare. It was one of a history of trying to figure out how to circumscribe warfare a little bit. The Powell Doctrine is one of the most recent. It's probably not the last time somebody will try to come up with a way to say, how do we do this horrible thing called war? This is what the Powell Doctrine does. It asks you 8 questions, guidelines, to see if you should go to war. 1, is national security threatened? 2, do we have clear, obtainable objectives? 3, are risks and costs fully analyzed? 4, have nonviolent means been fully exhausted? 5, is there an exit strategy? 6, have consequences of the action been fully considered? Other people crossing a strait, things like that. 7, is the action supported by the American people? And 8, do we have broad international support? Obviously, our current war with Iran did not consider the Powell Doctrine. Memorial Day reminds us very specifically about the cost of war. Throughout history, the perpetrators of war tried to lessen the horror, the burden by these rules of warfare, and usually there are 2 kinds of guidelines. And you can kind of hear them a little bit in the Powell Doctrine. One is whether and when you go to war. The other is, well, if you go to war, how do you do that war, right? So 2 kinds of guidelines. So just war theory actually has them set up that way, 4 of this kind and 4 of the other kind. Very similar, though. So for a war to be just, you have to have a just cause, legitimate authority, the probability of success. Don't go to war if you're just going to get squashed. And for it to be the last resort. And once you get into war, you do need to use just means. At some point, 1,000,000 years ago, the American bishop said, no war can be just any longer, according to the just war theory, because there is no such thing as just means anymore in the modern warfare between nuclear power uses and chemical warfare and all. So if you don't have just means, you're really not supposed to do war. So there needs to be just means, there needs to be proportionality. Don't go to war with a tiny nation, right? Avoid hurting non-combatants. We know about that one. And be understood that this might be a military necessity, but what the real aim is to establish peace. Just war theory. I know, you didn't think you were going to get that today, but I love the just war theory. I know that the former President Carter brought it up one time in an op-ed piece to talk about why we shouldn't do what we were doing at the time. It was after his presidency. Well, we have guidelines for all parts of our lives. Yeah, many sources of guidelines. We need guidance, right? We need it in the terms of laws and rules and principles, guidelines. We need it from our government. We need it from our religion. Christians and Jews have the Ten Commandments. They have the Torah, the Talmud, the Beatitudes, church doctrines, wisdom teachings of prophets and saints. So many sources. Buddhism has that eightfold path that has things in it like right intention, right speech. It's a way of figuring out how to do right living. It's guidelines for right living. And Buddhists also have, of course, writings and teachings of their various sages of the ages. Sometimes they simplify their guidance as mindfulness, compassion, and simplicity. It's nice to just have 3 words, isn't it? Taoists have something really simple. It's a small little book called the Tao Te Ching, which really means the way to live. And it talks about, how do you live, whether as an individual or a government, everything in between. We Unitarian Universalists have long had the 7 principles, right? That we covenanted to affirm and promote. And we can find those beautiful principles at the beginning of our hymnals. More recently, we developed this idea of shared values, and they center them around love. Love is the biggest shared value. It's kind of like the Buddhists having only 3 words. Well, we're not as tiny with our words as the Buddhists, but it's only like 7, So love, pluralism, generosity, interdependence, equity, justice, and transformation. So these 7 values are pretty simple, easy to remember, and that's part of the point, I'm sure. The principles or the 7 values, they are ways that we think of as Unitarian Universalists to give us some basic guidelines, ways to live. How do we live our lives? Well, some guidelines, some rules to live by are not quite so lofty, nevertheless very important. I'm old. I was recently reading my AARP. A few of you maybe read yours too, but there was in it something about a new grandmother. She was having to learn some new rules in her life. It had to do with sharing pictures. She has wonderful grandchildren, don't we all? Adorable grandchildren. One of the first rules she had to learn was that, maybe only share 2 pictures at a time with your friends, like don't overwhelm them. But then, of course, her kids were doing what many of the parents of the grandchildren do these days, limiting. There's a sense of the privacy of the family, but there's a more important principle at work that you don't just put up every picture of a child on social media, because bad things can happen. When you share things across the internet, grandchildren are way too precious to put their lives at risk because things get shared. So in a similar vein, not that long ago, I don't know if this congregation took it to heart, ours did in Bennington, but the Unitarian Universalist Association said, all right, a whole bunch of you congregations have put your list of who's in the congregation and their addresses and their phone numbers, and you publish it. Maybe you have it out on the table, but also you might have it on your website. You might have it on the internet somewhere, and guess what? Terrible things have been happening. One of the most common things, and you've probably seen this scam yourself, Reverend Carol is in trouble. Reverend Carol's husband or her whatever family member is in trouble, and now they have everybody's data point, and they say, you and you and you and you all need to come and give us money to help Reverend Carroll. That was one of the most common scams out there in churchy land. So the Unitarian Universalist Association put out this guideline to help us to all stay safe in terms of the internet. It's a worthy guideline. Of course, we don't love rules, any of us. Nah. While I was prepping for this, you know what I did? I went to first I went to my files, and I said, oh, I'm doing a sermon, and I'm thinking about guidelines, and I'm looking, I have a huge file. I have a big filing cabinet full of files, and I have it alphabetical. Well, where's my folder on guidelines? None. Rules? None. Laws? None. And I said, okay, the back of the hymnal? None. They're not back there either. We're not really that interested in talking about guidelines even. We don't like them. Sometimes we humans downright hate rules and guidelines, especially when they're hard or when they change them. You know, you finally figure out the guideline, the rule, and then whoosh, you know, it's gone. I'm looking at you, IRS. We want guidelines that we follow to be maybe a bit loosey-goosey, to make sense, to be kind, not too strict, to have exceptions when it's important. But just as I cling to my European sense of property when I really should abide more by American rules, we sometimes have to live within the guidelines we are given. And sometimes we have to break them for the greater good, but that's another sermon altogether. So may we be wise in the way of guidelines. Blessed be guidelines for living anyway. Blessings be upon all of you.